"Nobody is coming," the auctioneer said as he glanced across the nearly empty courthouse lawn. "If the payment isn't made in the next 5 minutes, this property becomes county inventory." A cold October breeze swept through the old maple trees lining Main Street in Ashford, Ohio, carrying dry leaves across the cracked stone walkway. The white farmhouse at the edge of town stood quietly behind a weathered wooden fence, its faded blue shutters hanging slightly crooked after decades of harsh winters and humid summers. Children once filled that front porch with laughter, but today only one rocking chair moved gently in the wind. Naomi Brooks sat wrapped in a worn brown cardigan, her silver curls glowing softly beneath the pale afternoon light. At 68 years old, she looked smaller than people remembered, yet her posture still carried the quiet dignity that had made generations of frightened children feel safe. She watched strangers gather near the mailbox where a foreclosure notice fluttered against the porch rail. No anger crossed her face, only acceptance. She folded her trembling hands together and whispered, "Lord, whatever happens, let this house remember love." Across the yard, neighbors stood in little circles pretending not to stare, while whispering just loudly enough to be heard. She should have sold years ago. Taking in those boys ruined her. 4 mouths to feed on a cafeteria paycheck. Everyone knew how that would end. Naomi heard every word. She always had. 24 years earlier, they had laughed the same way when she carried grocery bags through town after working double shifts at the church kitchen. They laughed when she patched holes in secondhand sneakers instead of buying new ones. They laughed when an old station wagon pulled into her driveway carrying 4 frightened boys nobody else wanted. Their laughter had changed over the years, but never disappeared. The county clerk checked his watch while the auctioneer organized a stack of legal documents on a folding table. The bank representative adjusted his expensive navy coat and avoided looking toward the porch. To him it was another file, another overdue mortgage, another forgotten address. He knew nothing about the fingerprints covering every doorway inside that house. He knew nothing about birthday candles blown out around a tiny kitchen table or bedtime stories read beneath blankets during power outages. He certainly knew nothing about the promise Naomi had whispered to 4 strangers one rainy evening long ago. "As long as I breathe," she had told them, "you will never wonder if somebody wants you." The church bell rang 3 slow times from downtown. 4 minutes remained. Naomi closed her eyes as memories drifted across her heart like sunlight through old windows. Tiny shoes drying beside a heater. Homework spread across the dining table. 4 boys arguing over pancakes because there was only enough syrup for one more serving. Christmas mornings where every gift came from thrift stores but every smile was genuine. Those moments were worth more than every dollar she had ever owed. A black SUV appeared at the far end of Main Street before disappearing behind a delivery truck. No one paid attention. Ashford rarely saw luxury vehicles, but they sometimes passed through on the highway. The auctioneer cleared his throat and lifted his gavel. "If there are no final payments or legal objections," his voice echoed through the chilly afternoon, just as another black SUV turned onto Maple Avenue, followed by a second, then a third, and finally a fourth. The quiet town seemed to hold its breath as sunlight flashed across polished windshields. And for the first time that afternoon, every person standing on the courthouse lawn turned toward the road in complete silence. The 4 sport utility vehicles rolled forward at the same steady pace, their headlights reflecting across the courthouse windows until they came to a smooth stop beside the old maple trees. No one stepped out. The engines remained quietly humming, as if the passengers inside were waiting for something unseen. The auctioneer lowered his gavel without realizing it. Conversations dissolved into silence. Even the wind seemed to soften. Naomi remained seated on the porch, her weathered hands resting on the arms of the rocking chair. She did not recognize the vehicles, yet something deep inside her heart stirred with a feeling she could not explain. The bank representative glanced nervously toward the county clerk. "Are they here for the auction?" he whispered. The clerk only shrugged. Ashford was a town where everyone knew everyone. Expensive vehicles like these belonged somewhere else. The sight alone felt out of place against the faded storefronts, the church steeple, and the rows of modest homes that had stood unchanged for decades. As every eye remained fixed on the mysterious arrivals, Naomi's thoughts drifted backward, far beyond the foreclosure notice, beyond the unpaid bills, beyond the lonely years after her boys had left to build lives of their own. She remembered another gray afternoon, almost 25 years earlier, when rain had fallen so heavily that the streets looked like shallow rivers. She had just finished a double shift serving dinner at the church kitchen, her shoes soaked through and her shoulders aching from carrying trays all day. Pastor Raymond had called her before she reached her old station wagon. His voice carried the same quiet concern she had heard many times before. "Naomi, there are 4 boys at St. Matthew's Children's Shelter. They arrived together this morning. No relatives. No foster placement. They may be separated by tomorrow." She had paused with her hand on the car door. "How old are they?" "The youngest is 6. The oldest cannot be more than 11. She nodded slowly, looking through the rain toward the small brick shelter across the street. Inside, 4 frightened children sat shoulder to shoulder on a wooden bench, each holding a small plastic bag containing everything they owned. None of them cried. Somehow that hurt even more. Children should cry when they are afraid. These boys simply stared at the floor, as though disappointment had become something ordinary. Naomi walked through the front door carrying nothing but a paper sack with 4 homemade cinnamon rolls she had planned to save for herself. The room smelled faintly of laundry soap and tomato soup. One by one, she placed a warm roll into each pair of tiny hands. The youngest looked up first. "Are these really for us?" he asked quietly. Naomi smiled with gentle eyes that carried more kindness than certainty. Every child deserves something warm before the day ends. The oldest boy hesitated before taking a careful bite. He studied her face, as though searching for the moment she would change her mind and walk away like everyone else had. She never did. Instead, she pulled up an old folding chair, sat beside them without saying another word, and simply shared the silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the Ohio sky, but inside that small shelter, another kind of storm had already begun to calm. Pastor Raymond quietly watched from the reception desk, giving Naomi all the time she needed. The 4 boys finished their cinnamon rolls without rushing, carefully brushing every crumb from their laps as though wasting even the smallest piece would somehow be disrespectful. The oldest finally spoke. "People usually tell us not to get comfortable." His voice was calm, almost practiced, carrying a weight no 11-year-old should have known. Naomi nodded gently. "Then nobody has told you the right thing yet." The room fell silent again. Rain tapped softly against the windows while an old wall clock counted each passing second. Naomi noticed the smallest boy leaning closer to his older brothers without realizing it, seeking comfort simply by being near them. She noticed another boy quietly folding the empty paper napkin into perfect little squares, giving nervous hands something to do. The tallest sat perfectly straight, trying to look brave even though his shoes were several sizes too small. They were different children with different fears, yet one thing united them all. Every time the shelter door opened, all 4 looked toward it with the same expression. Hope first, then disappointment. Pastor Raymond carried over a thin folder. Their names are Ethan Carter, Noah Bennett, Liam Walker, and Caleb Harris. Naomi slowly repeated each name under her breath, making sure she would remember them correctly. She had always believed that learning someone's name was the first act of respect. "Will they stay together?" she asked quietly. The pastor lowered his eyes. "That depends. Families willing to take 4 children at once are almost impossible to find. By tomorrow morning, they will probably be transferred to different counties." 4 pairs of young eyes immediately dropped toward the floor. No tears, no protests. They had already learned that adults often discuss their futures as though they were furniture being moved from one room to another. Naomi felt something tighten deep inside her chest. She had lived alone since losing both her mother and grandmother within the same year. Her little farmhouse suddenly felt different in her memory. The empty bedrooms, the quiet dinner table, the hallway that echoed every evening after work. She had spent years believing loneliness was simply part of growing older. Looking at those boys, she realized loneliness could arrive much earlier than anyone deserved. "May I ask them something?" she said. Pastor Raymond nodded. Naomi turned toward the children with the same warm smile she had worn from the moment she entered. "If you could wish for one thing tonight, what would it be?" Caleb answered first. "A place where nobody sends us away tomorrow," Liam whispered. "A room with my brothers." Noah stared at the floor before saying, "Someone who remembers our birthdays." Ethan remained quiet the longest. Finally, he looked directly into Naomi's eyes. "I just want somebody who stays." The words settled over the room more heavily than the rain outside. Naomi inhaled slowly. She had less than $900 in her savings account. Her old station wagon needed repairs. Her church kitchen paycheck barely covered groceries and utilities for one person. Every practical reason told her to walk away. Instead, she stood, picked up her purse, and looked at Pastor Raymond with calm certainty. "Please bring me the paperwork," she said. The pastor blinked in surprise. "Naomi, you mean?" She smiled before he could finish. "I am taking all four home." Pastor Raymond remained motionless for several seconds, the adoption form still resting in his hands as though they suddenly weighed far more than paper ever should. "Naomi," he said softly, "this is not a decision people make in one afternoon." She smiled with quiet confidence and looked toward the four boys, who had not moved from the wooden bench. "No," she replied, "it is a decision that begins long before today. Sometimes your heart already knows what your mind is still trying to calculate." Within an hour, signatures covered every required page. The shelter staff gathered coats, extra blankets, and the few belongings each boy owned. 4 small plastic bags sat neatly beside the front door, holding worn shirts, faded photographs, a broken toy truck, and a handful of treasured keepsakes that could fit into the palms of children who had learned not to expect much. Naomi carried each bag herself, treating them as though they held priceless treasures instead of almost nothing. Outside, the rain had softened into a gentle mist. Her aging station wagon waited beneath the flickering streetlight, its paint faded from years beneath Ohio summers and snowy winters. Pastor Raymond helped load the bags into the back while the boys climbed inside without saying much. Caleb stared out the side window. Noah quietly counted telephone poles as though trying to calm his thoughts. Liam leaned against Ethan, who instinctively placed one arm around his younger brother. Naomi started the engine, which protested before finally settling into its familiar rumble. The heater blew only lukewarm air, but nobody complained. As they drove through Ashford, people noticed. A cashier leaving the grocery store paused with her umbrella halfway open. 2 men standing outside the hardware store watched the old wagon pass. By the time Naomi turned onto Maple Road, whispers had already begun spreading through town. She actually brought them home. 4 boys? How is she going to feed them? She can barely take care of herself. The comments reached Naomi long before the following Sunday. After church service, several familiar faces approached with careful smiles that barely concealed their doubts. One woman folded her arms and said, "You have a kind heart, Naomi, but kindness does not pay electric bills." Another shook his head. "Those children have been through too much. They will only bring trouble." Naomi listened without arguing. She simply thanked them for their concern and continued walking toward her old station wagon where 4 little boys waited patiently inside. That evening, the farmhouse felt wonderfully unfamiliar. Shoes lined the front hallway instead of standing alone. 4 toothbrushes rested beside hers in the tiny bathroom. Laughter mixed awkwardly with nervous silence as everyone tried to understand what living together might feel like. Supper was simple. Vegetable soup, homemade cornbread, and sliced apples divided carefully into equal portions. Naomi noticed Ethan quietly giving part of his bread to Caleb when he thought nobody was looking. She pretended not to see because dignity sometimes grows best when kindness happens without applause. After dinner, she showed each boy his bed. None of the mattresses matched. The blankets came from church donations. The bedroom walls needed fresh paint. Yet every pillow had been fluffed before they arrived, and a small handwritten card rested on each nightstand. It contained only 2 words: "Welcome home." As darkness settled beyond the windows, Naomi stood in the hallway listening to the quiet sounds drifting from the bedrooms. No crying, no frightened footsteps. Only the gentle creaking of old beds and 4 children slowly discovering what safety sounded like. Then, just before she turned off the hallway light, a small voice whispered from the bedroom doorway, "Miss Naomi, are we still going to be here when the sun comes up?" Naomi turned toward the small bedroom doorway and found Caleb standing there barefoot, clutching the edge of his blanket with both hands. The hallway light cast a warm glow across his worried face, while the rest of the house settled into the quiet rhythm of an old home finally filled with life again. She walked over without hurrying and knelt until they were eye level. "Yes," she answered gently. "When the sun comes up, you will still be here. The day after that, too. And if the Lord gives me another morning after that, you will still be here." Caleb searched her face for the kind of certainty children only expect from someone who has never broken a promise. After a long moment, he nodded and climbed back into bed. Naomi tucked the blanket around his shoulders before softly switching off the lamp. That first night she hardly slept. Every unfamiliar sound pulled her awake. A bedroom door opening, quiet footsteps in the hallway, the creak of old floorboards. Around 2 in the morning, she found Ethan sitting alone at the kitchen table, wrapped in a donated blanket while moonlight spilled through the window above the sink. He looked embarrassed when he saw her. "I was making sure we did not have to leave before morning," he admitted. Naomi poured 2 cups of warm milk, placing one in front of him. "This house has one rule," she said. "Nobody has to earn the right to stay." Ethan lowered his eyes, holding the warm mug with both hands as if trying to memorize the feeling. The next morning arrived with the smell of pancakes, maple syrup, and fresh coffee drifting through every room. The farmhouse suddenly sounded different. Chairs scraped against the floor. Cabinets opened and closed. 4 boys argued over whose turn it was to wash dishes before laughing at the realization that none of them had ever been asked to help with breakfast before. Naomi smiled quietly as she watched them discover ordinary routines that most families never noticed. After breakfast, she walked them through the backyard where an old oak tree stood beside a weathered tire swing that had not been used in years. The grass needed mowing, and the fence leaned slightly after countless winters, but to the boys it looked enormous. Caleb ran toward the swing, while Liam examined an old birdhouse nailed high on the tree. Noah wandered into the small vegetable garden, asking the names of every plant. Ethan remained close to the porch, still studying the house as though he expected someone to arrive and tell them a mistake had been made. Later that afternoon, Naomi unpacked the few belongings each child owned into separate dresser drawers. There was still plenty of empty space, yet she folded every shirt carefully and placed every treasured item exactly where each boy wanted it. "Even little things deserve a proper place," she told them. As evening settled over Ashford, the telephone rang 3 different times. Neighbors called politely to offer opinions disguised as concern. Some questioned whether she had made the right decision. Others reminded her how expensive children could be. Naomi thanked every caller with kindness before quietly hanging up the receiver. She looked toward the dining room where 4 boys were coloring pictures with borrowed crayons, their laughter filling every corner of the old farmhouse. Then she whispered to herself with a peaceful smile, "Love has never been the expensive part. Giving up on people always costs more." Life settled into a rhythm that could never be called easy, but it slowly became familiar. Every weekday began before sunrise. Naomi tied on her faded apron at 5:30 each morning, packed 4 simple lunches into brown paper bags, and left handwritten notes inside each one. Some only said, "I believe in you." Others read, "Come home hungry because supper will be waiting." The words were different every day, but they always ended the same way. Love, Miss Naomi. She worked long hours in the church kitchen, stirring giant pots of soup, baking cornbread, and washing trays until her hands grew rough from hot water and soap. When the lunch crowd disappeared, she quietly wrapped leftover dinner rolls that would otherwise be thrown away, always asking permission before placing them into a cloth bag for the boys. Nothing was wasted. Every dollar had a purpose. Every meal carried gratitude. At home, the 4 brothers slowly learned that a family was built through ordinary moments repeated with patience. Monday evenings belonged to homework around the kitchen table. Tuesdays were laundry nights, with socks hanging from every chair because the old dryer stopped working whenever it rained. Saturdays meant cleaning the house together before spending an hour in the garden pulling weeds and watering tomato plants. Naomi never called these chores. She called them investments. "A home grows stronger every time everyone helps," she would remind them with a smile. The boys were not perfect. Caleb occasionally forgot to make his bed because he rushed outside the moment breakfast ended. Liam became so fascinated by old radios and broken clocks that he scattered tiny screws across the dining room table while trying to understand how everything worked. Noah filled notebooks with questions about the stars, airplanes, and every strange fact he discovered at the public library. Ethan watched over everyone without being asked, often making sure his younger brothers had enough before thinking about himself. One chilly November afternoon, Naomi found all 4 sitting quietly on the front porch after school. Their lunch bags remained unopened beside them. "What happened?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated before answering. Some kids laughed because our lunches were different. They said homemade food means you are poor. Naomi looked at the paper bags for a long moment before inviting the boys into the kitchen. She spread flour across the old wooden counter and handed each child a small piece of dough. Together they shaped biscuits while the smell of butter slowly filled the house. As the biscuits baked, she spoke without raising her voice. People often judge what they can see. They cannot see sacrifice. They cannot taste gratitude. Never let someone else's opinion decide your value. The timer rang, and warm biscuits emerged golden from the oven. Naomi broke one open, steam curling into the afternoon light, then placed a piece into each small hand. "Remember this," she said. "There will always be people who measure wealth by what is inside a wallet. I hope you become men who measure wealth by what is inside a heart." The boys nodded quietly as they ate together around the worn kitchen table. And although none of them realized it then, that simple lesson would remain with each of them long after the memory of every childish insult had faded away. The years passed quietly, measured not by calendars, but by pencil marks on the kitchen doorway, where Naomi recorded each inch the boys grew. Every birthday she stood them against the old wooden frame with the same smile, pretending not to notice that Ethan's shoulders were becoming broader. Noah's glasses had grown thicker from endless nights of reading. Liam's hands carried permanent smudges of grease from repairing anything mechanical he could find, and Caleb's laugh had become the loudest sound in the entire house. The farmhouse itself seemed to grow with them, the walls filled with school photographs, handmade Mother's Day cards, spelling test ribbons, science fair certificates, and faded snapshots taken with a disposable camera that Naomi carefully tucked into worn albums every Christmas. Money remained tight, but love never seemed to notice. Every Friday evening, Naomi declared the dining room table closed for business. Homework waited until Saturday morning. Friday belonged to conversation. One by one, each boy shared something that had gone well during the week and something that had been difficult. No interruption was allowed. No teasing was permitted. Everyone listened until the speaker finished. People bloom when they know somebody is listening. Naomi always reminded them while pouring sweet tea into mismatched glasses. Those evenings quietly shaped the family more than anyone realized. Ethan gradually stopped carrying the burden of protecting everyone by himself because he learned his own worries mattered too. Noah discovered that asking questions was not a weakness but a gift. Liam gained confidence every time Naomi admired another repaired toaster, lamp, or old bicycle rescued from the curb. Caleb, once afraid to sleep through the night, became the first to welcome every new student at school who looked lonely. One autumn afternoon, their principal called Naomi into the office. She folded her hands as she sat across from the polished oak desk, wondering which boy had gotten into trouble. Instead, the principal smiled. "Mrs. Brooks, I wanted you to know something unusual happened today." Naomi tilted her head. "What happened?" The principal opened a folder containing a handwritten essay from Caleb's 5th grade class. The assignment was to write about a hero. Naomi smiled politely. "I imagine there were a lot of firefighters and astronauts." The principal nodded with a quiet laugh. "Most of them. Caleb wrote about you." He handed her the paper. The handwriting leaned in every direction. Letters still uneven with childhood, but every sentence was sincere. It read, "My hero does not wear a cape. She wears an apron that smells like bread. She always says home is not where you start. Home is where somebody keeps choosing you every day." Naomi blinked slowly as tears gathered in her eyes. She pressed the paper gently against her chest without speaking. On the drive home, golden leaves drifted across the windshield while late afternoon sunlight poured through the trees lining Maple Road. She realized that none of the sacrifices she had made had disappeared into ordinary days. The boys had been watching all along. That evening, she quietly slipped Caleb's essay into the family photo album beside the first picture ever taken of all 5 of them standing on the farmhouse porch. Looking at both memories together, she whispered to herself with grateful certainty, "Roots grow long before anyone sees the tree." Winter arrived with frosted windows, early sunsets, and long evenings gathered around the fireplace that Naomi had learned to keep alive with little more than patience and carefully stacked firewood. The farmhouse had become too small for 4 growing boys, yet somehow it always found room for one more dream. Ethan entered high school carrying the quiet confidence of someone who no longer questioned whether he belonged. Noah spent every free afternoon at the public library, borrowing books about engineering, astronomy, and mathematics, until the librarian began setting new arrivals aside just for him. Liam transformed the old shed behind the house into a tiny workshop where broken lawnmowers, clocks, and bicycles somehow left working better than before. Caleb filled every room with laughter, helping elderly neighbors carry groceries without being asked and shoveling snow from sidewalks simply because he noticed someone needed help. Naomi watched each of them carefully, never trying to decide who would become the most successful. Instead, she paid attention to something else entirely. She noticed who returned a shopping cart for a stranger. She noticed who thanked the school bus driver every afternoon. She noticed who quietly washed another person's dishes without expecting praise. One Saturday morning, she placed 4 envelopes on the breakfast table. Inside each envelope was exactly $20, money she had quietly saved over several months by skipping her own lunches twice a week. The boys stared at the bills in surprise. Ethan looked up first. "What is this for?" Naomi smiled as she poured coffee into her favorite chipped mug. "It belongs to each of you. Spend it any way you choose. I will not ask where it goes." The boys exchanged puzzled glances before carefully placing the envelopes into their pockets. 3 days later, they returned home from school carrying very different expressions. Noah had purchased a used science textbook from a secondhand bookstore. Liam proudly carried a box of worn tools bought at a yard sale. Caleb admitted he had spent nearly all of his money buying mittens and socks for a classmate whose family could not afford winter clothes. Ethan quietly placed $5 back on the kitchen table. Naomi looked at him with gentle curiosity. "Did you not find anything you wanted?" Ethan shook his head. "I found something better." He explained that an elderly man at the grocery store had come up short while paying for medicine. Ethan had quietly covered the difference and kept the remaining $5 because he thought someone else might need help tomorrow. Naomi did not speak immediately. Instead, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Then she looked at all 4 boys with eyes shining in the warm kitchen light. "Education will help you make a living," she said softly. "Talent may open doors. Hard work will carry you farther than most people. But kindness is the only thing that keeps every door worth walking through from closing behind you." Outside, snowflakes drifted gently across the old oak tree, while inside the farmhouse another lesson settled quietly into 4 young hearts. None of them realized that years later they would remember those $20 more clearly than any expensive gift they would ever receive, because on that ordinary winter morning Naomi had given them something far greater than money. She had shown them exactly who they were becoming. By the time spring returned, the boys had become young men, and the little farmhouse seemed to exhale with every milestone it witnessed. College acceptance letters arrived one by one, each tucked carefully into the old wooden mailbox that Naomi checked every afternoon after work. Ethan earned admission to a respected law school with the help of scholarships and countless late nights studying beneath the yellow kitchen light. Noah received an engineering scholarship after winning a statewide science competition with a design he had built from recycled materials in Liam's workshop. Liam was accepted into one of the best mechanical engineering programs in the state after a local business owner wrote a heartfelt recommendation describing the teenager who could repair almost anything with patience instead of expensive parts. Caleb, whose compassion had become as natural as breathing, earned a place in a nursing program after volunteering hundreds of hours at the county hospital. The day each letter arrived, Naomi celebrated exactly the same way. She baked her homemade peach cobbler, lit a single candle in the middle, and thanked God before anyone took the first bite. She never praised grades or awards first. Instead, she reminded them, "You are leaving this house with good minds, but I pray you never leave without good hearts." Graduation season arrived beneath bright blue skies and rows of folding chairs spread across the football field. Naomi sat alone in the bleachers, wearing the same navy blue church dress she had owned for years, holding a small camera that occasionally refused to work unless she gently tapped the side. As each young man crossed the stage, they searched the crowd until they found her smiling face. Every diploma felt like a promise fulfilled. Every round of applause belonged as much to the woman who had quietly believed in them as it did to the students themselves. Summer disappeared faster than anyone expected. Suitcases replaced school backpacks. The bedrooms that had once echoed with laughter slowly emptied one by one. Ethan left first, hugging Naomi so tightly she could barely breathe. "Everything I become started here," he whispered. Noah promised to call every Sunday evening no matter how busy classes became. Liam carefully repaired the squeaky front gate before leaving, because he could not bear the thought of something in the house remaining broken. Caleb cried openly as he loaded his bags into a friend's pickup truck, apologizing for crying even though Naomi simply smiled and wiped away his tears. She stood on the porch long after the last vehicle disappeared around the bend in Maple Road. The silence that settled over the farmhouse felt unfamiliar again, but this time it carried pride instead of loneliness. Inside, 4 neatly made beds waited in empty bedrooms, each exactly as their owners had left them. The kitchen table suddenly seemed much larger, with only one plate resting on it each evening. Neighbors watched from a distance and quietly shook their heads. "They are gone now," some whispered. Young people always forget where they came from. Others assumed Naomi would soon sell the old house and move somewhere smaller. She never argued with them. Every Sunday afternoon, she still prepared 4 extra places at the dinner table before gently smiling and putting the unused plates back into the cabinet. She was not waiting because she doubted their love. She was waiting because real homes never stop expecting family to come through the front door, even when the road ahead is longer than anyone imagined. The seasons continued their quiet march across Ashford, and the little farmhouse aged with the woman who refused to leave it. The white paint peeled a little more each summer. The porch steps creaked a little louder each winter. Naomi still rose before sunrise, although the church kitchen had long since replaced her full-time position with younger workers. She accepted part-time hours without complaint, smiling as she folded aprons at the end of every shift and tucked a few dollars into an old cookie tin hidden above the refrigerator. Every month she paid what she could toward the mortgage. Every month, the balance seemed to grow instead of shrink. Medical bills quietly joined the stack of envelopes beside the kitchen calendar after her doctor warned that her heart was not as strong as it used to be. Naomi thanked him kindly, filled only the prescriptions she could afford, and told no one. She never wanted the boys to carry worry when they were busy building the futures she had prayed for since the day they first walked through her front door. Their phone calls still came, sometimes every week, sometimes after longer stretches when work and school demanded more of them than they expected. Ethan spoke about long nights preparing legal briefs. Noah described engineering projects that sounded too complicated for Naomi to fully understand, though she celebrated every achievement anyway. Liam laughed while telling stories about machines that refused to cooperate until sunrise. Caleb shared gentle stories about patients who reminded him that compassion often healed more than medicine alone. Naomi listened far more than she talked. Whenever one of them asked how she was doing, she always answered the same way. "I am doing just fine, sweetheart. Tell me about your week." She never mentioned the leaking roof she patched with borrowed tools. She never mentioned skipping new winter boots because the old ones still had one good season left. She certainly never mentioned the letters arriving from the bank, with increasingly urgent language printed across the top. One crisp October afternoon, she returned from the grocery store carrying a single paper bag filled with oatmeal, milk, and fresh apples purchased on sale. As she walked toward the porch, she noticed an official envelope tucked beneath the front door. The county seal was stamped across the corner. She stood quietly beneath the old oak tree before opening it. The notice informed her that unless the remaining balance was paid within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Naomi slowly folded the paper, slipped it back into the envelope, and rested one hand against the porch railing, polished, smooth by decades of little hands racing through the house. She looked toward the empty tire swing, moving gently in the autumn breeze, and closed her eyes. Memories returned as clearly as yesterday. 4 boys chasing fireflies across the yard. 4 backpacks leaning against the hallway wall. 4 voices calling, "Miss Naomi, look what I made." A soft smile appeared despite the weight in her heart. "This house already did what it was meant to do," she whispered. "If I have to let it go, thank you for every beautiful day we shared inside these walls." The following week, the county scheduled the public auction, and word traveled through Ashford faster than the falling leaves. Some neighbors expressed sympathy. Others quietly assumed the story had finally reached its inevitable ending. Naomi simply swept the porch one more time, watered the roses planted beside the front steps, and placed 4 clean dinner plates back into the kitchen cabinet. never imagining that the road leading toward Maple Avenue was already carrying a promise made many years before. The engines fell silent one after another until the only sound left on Maple Avenue was the rustling of autumn leaves beneath the old oak tree. Every face turned toward the 4 black sport utility vehicles parked beside the courthouse lawn. The auctioneer lowered his papers. The bank representative adjusted his glasses, unsure whether to continue or wait. Naomi remained seated on the porch, her hands folded peacefully in her lap, offering no sign that she recognized what was about to happen. The driver's door of the first vehicle opened slowly. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped onto the pavement. His polished shoes crossed the gravel with measured confidence, but when his eyes reached the white farmhouse, that confidence softened into something far more personal. He stood still for a long moment, before quietly removing his sunglasses. Several people in the crowd whispered to one another, trying to identify him. No one could. The second vehicle opened next. Another man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase worn from years of travel. The third door revealed a broad-shouldered man whose steady hands bore the faint marks of mechanical work despite the tailored jacket he wore. Finally, the fourth vehicle opened, and a man in a navy blue medical coat emerged with a stethoscope still hanging from one shoulder as though he had left a hospital in the middle of an ordinary day without stopping to change. The 4 strangers looked at one another, exchanged silent smiles, and began walking toward the farmhouse together. Their pace was unhurried, almost reverent. Naomi watched them approach, narrowing her eyes against the afternoon sunlight. Time had added height, strength, and years to their faces, but there were small things that never changed. The oldest still instinctively walked half a step ahead of the others. One absent-mindedly adjusted his glasses exactly as he had done while reading library books at the kitchen table. Another glanced toward the old shed before looking at the house, just as he once checked every broken bicycle waiting to be repaired. The youngest smiled with the same warmth that had once greeted lonely classmates on their first day of school. Naomi slowly rose from the rocking chair. Her heart seemed to forget every burden it had carried during the past few months. The grocery bills, the foreclosure notice, the sleepless nights, all of it disappeared beneath one overwhelming realization. Tears gathered before she could speak. Ethan stopped only a few feet from the porch steps. His voice trembled with emotion that years had never erased. "Miss Naomi," Noah smiled through eyes already shining with tears. "We told you we would come home." Liam looked toward the weathered porch railing he had repaired before leaving for college so many years earlier. It was still standing. Caleb quietly climbed the first wooden step and opened his arms without saying another word. Naomi crossed the porch and embraced all 4 of them as laughter and tears blended into the crisp October air. Around them, the town stood perfectly still. The same neighbors who had once questioned whether 4 unwanted boys would ruin her life now watched 4 accomplished men holding tightly to the woman who had refused to let them believe they were unwanted. The auctioneer slowly lowered his gavel onto the table without making a sound because, for the first time that afternoon, everyone understood that something far more important than a property sale had just arrived. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The courthouse lawn, which had been filled with quiet conversations only moments earlier, stood wrapped in complete silence. The bank representative looked from the 4 men to Naomi, then back to the foreclosure documents resting on the folding table. Ethan finally stepped forward and offered a courteous handshake. "Good afternoon," he said calmly. "My name is Ethan Brooks." The last name caused several people in the crowd to glance at one another. Years ago, he had arrived in Ashford carrying someone else's last name inside a small plastic bag of belongings. Now he carried the name of the woman who had given him a family. Noah stood beside him, placing a neatly organized folder on the auction table. "We would like to review every document before any further proceedings continue." His voice was polite, steady, and impossible to ignore. Liam quietly walked toward the farmhouse instead of the crowd. He rested one hand against the porch railing he had repaired as a teenager, and smiled when he noticed it still standing strong after so many years. "You took good care of it," he whispered. Naomi laughed softly. "I had a good teacher." Caleb remained beside Naomi, gently taking her grocery bag from her hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "You still buy the same apples," he said with a smile. "Some habits are worth keeping," she replied. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, unless there is a legal reason to delay this sale, Ethan reached into his briefcase and removed a certified bank check. He placed it carefully on the table without the slightest hint of pride. There is. The outstanding balance will be paid in full today. The bank representative blinked in surprise before examining the amount printed across the check. His expression changed immediately. He reviewed the paperwork twice, then looked up with genuine respect. This covers the mortgage, every late fee, accumulated interest, legal expenses, and closing costs. Ethan nodded. That is correct. Noah opened another folder containing additional documents. There is one more request. After the mortgage is released, ownership of the property will immediately be transferred into the Naomi Brooks Family Trust, so that this home can never again face foreclosure during her lifetime. The county clerk quietly adjusted his glasses while reading each page. Everything was professionally prepared, properly signed, and fully compliant with state law. There was nothing left to question. Around the lawn, neighbors who had once predicted failure stood speechless. The old whispers about impossible dreams had vanished beneath undeniable reality. Naomi looked from one son to the next, her eyes filling with tears she no longer tried to hide. "Sweethearts," she whispered, "you did not have to do all of this." Caleb smiled with the same warmth he had carried as a little boy. "Yes, we did." Liam looked toward the old farmhouse glowing beneath the afternoon sun. "You fixed every broken thing inside us." Noah gently folded the foreclosure notice and slipped it into his folder. "We only fixed a house." Ethan took Naomi's weathered hands into his own. "You spent years teaching us that a home is where somebody keeps choosing you every day. Today, it is our turn to choose you." As the county clerk stamped the final document, the sharp sound echoed across the quiet lawn, not like the end of an auction, but like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. The weeks that followed changed Ashford in ways no one could have predicted. The foreclosure signs disappeared from the front yard, replaced by freshly planted white roses that Caleb and Naomi placed together beside the porch steps one quiet Saturday morning. Liam organized local volunteers to restore the old farmhouse without changing the details that made it feel like home. The squeaky porch swing remained because Naomi loved its familiar sound. The pencil marks on the kitchen doorway recording every inch the boys had grown stayed exactly where they were, protected beneath a clear finish instead of painted over. Noah quietly upgraded the aging plumbing, heating system, and electrical wiring, making the house safer while preserving every memory held within its walls. Ethan completed the legal work establishing the Naomi Brooks Family Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping children who had been overlooked, forgotten, or left waiting for someone to believe in them. The foundation did not begin inside a modern office building. It began inside the same farmhouse, where 4 frightened boys had once shared homemade cinnamon rolls on their first evening as a family. Word spread quickly across Ohio. Churches donated books. Local businesses offered apprenticeships. Teachers volunteered tutoring hours after school. Retired couples signed up to mentor children who simply needed someone willing to listen. One afternoon, several months later, a little girl walked nervously through the front gate holding the hand of a social worker. She paused beneath the old oak tree and looked toward the farmhouse with uncertain eyes. Naomi stepped onto the porch wearing her familiar cardigan, her smile just as warm as it had been decades earlier. Before the little girl could say a word, Caleb quietly knelt beside her and asked, "Would you like to see the garden?" Liam smiled from the workshop where he was repairing an old bicycle for another child. Noah carried a stack of donated science books through the front door. Ethan welcomed the social worker with the same calm kindness Naomi had once shown 4 frightened brothers who believed they had reached the end of hope. The house was full again, not because the past had returned, but because kindness had continued its journey through new hands and new hearts. Late that evening, after everyone had gone home, Naomi sat once more in the old rocking chair overlooking the yard. The sunset painted the sky with shades of amber and gold, while children's laughter drifted softly from the playground the foundation had built beside the garden. Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of warm tea. He handed one to Naomi before taking the seat beside her. Neither spoke for several moments. They simply watched the fading light settle across the place that had changed all of their lives. Finally, Naomi smiled and whispered, "I used to worry about what would happen to this house after I was gone." Ethan gently shook his head. This was never just a house. He looked toward the children running beneath the old oak tree and smiled. You never gave us a perfect life. You gave us a reason to become better people. That is why this place will never be empty again. Naomi closed her eyes for a quiet moment, listening to the sound she had always loved most. Children laughing where fear had once lived. And she realized that the greatest legacy was never measured by what a person left behind, but by the goodness that continued long after someone chose to love without expecting anything in return.